Good afternoon and welcome, everyone. My name is Julia Santucci. I'm a senior lecturer at the Graduate School of Public and International Affairs here at the University of Pittsburgh, where I also direct the Johnson Institute for Responsible Leadership and the Frances Hesselbein Leadership Forum. I'm so excited to welcome you today to our Hesselbein Spring Lecture. We have an amazing guest, and I'm eager to get started. Just very quickly before we do, I thought I'd say a couple of words about the Hesselbein Forum. The Hesselbein Forum is the namesake of Frances Hesselbein, who grew up in Johnstown, Pennsylvania, and in 1932 enrolled in the University of Pittsburgh at Johnstown. Frances never graduated from the University of Pittsburgh, but she's since received over 22 honorary doctoral degrees, including one from GISBEA, which is where I now teach. Frances began her career as a volunteer Girl Scout troop leader, and she went on to become CEO of the Girl Scouts of the United States of America, where she transformed and diversified the organization. President Clinton awarded her the Presidential Medal of Freedom, our nation's highest civilian honor, for her work transforming and diversifying the Girl Scouts and for her leadership overall in the name of women and diversity. Just days after retiring from the Girl Scouts, Frances formed a nonprofit organization dedicated to expanding leadership opportunities in the social sector. And that organization transformed over 30 years and now exists as the Hesselbein Forum here at the University of Pittsburgh. Our mission is to develop and inspire current and future leaders. We do so through a variety of means, including student-focused leadership development programming and coaching, the publication of an award-winning leadership journal, Leader to Leader, and programs like the one you've all come here today, the Hesselbein Lecture Series. So with that, I'm going to turn to the main event and introduce our guest speaker. And I have to say that at a public and international affairs school, we're not often talking about art, and I think that's kind of a shame. The kind of transformational leadership that our society needs right now needs the talents of all individuals, and probably most especially the talents of our creative leaders. So I'm very excited to introduce our featured guest. Shaun Leonardo is a Brooklyn-based artist from Queens, New York City. His performance practice, anchored by his work in Assembly, which is a diversion program for court-involved youth at the Brooklyn-based arts nonprofit Recess, is participatory and invested in a process of embodiment. Shaun's solo exhibition, called The Breath of Empty Space, recently presented at MICA and MASS MoCA, will open soon at the Bronx Museum. Starting this year, Shaun joined Recess as co-director, helping guide the organization's continuous evolution as an engine of social change. So Shaun, I'm going to turn it over to you right now, but before I do audience, Shaun's going to speak for about 25 minutes or so, but afterwards we'd welcome a dialogue with all of you. You can use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen to submit questions. We'll try to get to as many as possible before we end around 2 o'clock. So Shaun, with that, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us, and I will turn it over to you.
Thank you, Julia, and thank you all in the virtual strangeness of Zoom that have decided to spend some time with me. You know, whenever I do these things, I try to fully acknowledge that a lot of life has transpired from the moment that you've woken up and have spent any amount of time out in the world or continuously on this Zoom platform, the flatness of your screen. And so just to offer a moment of disconnect and re-engagement, I'd like for you to do a few things. While I can't see you, I'd like to be able to do something with you and therefore feel you or potentially feel your presence. And so I just want to ask you to, as a way to remember that we do exist in physical space, just look over your shoulder. Recognize that you are somewhere, ideally safe. Look beyond your screen, over your camera, to whatever's in front of you. And look down at your feet. Consider the floor. And consider the physical architecture that we've been spending so much of our lives in the last year, a year for so many of us in Zoom space. And then just take a deep breath with me. I often recommend a 4-second in and a 4-second out on your own time. I find it's often important to remind ourselves that we have a body and that we exist in this body, even though so much of our experience has been limited to an engagement on this screen. And with that, I want to say that whenever I approach these invitations, I try to be really conscious and keen to speak directly to whomever might be joining me. And I was so compelled by the invitation as an artist to speak to notions of leadership, especially also with the acknowledgement that artists may not typically be invited to that space, to that type of conversation. And so with that being said, I'm going to attempt a bit of an experiment in which I will speak specifically of one aspect of my practice, namely the assembly program that Julia mentioned, a diversion program that works in conjunction with the criminal justice system, or as I've learned to prefer to call the American legal system. And I will do so and speak to my role in this practice and as a leader in that space and in the organization, but without using the terms leadership, nor community, nor social justice. As an experiment in forcing myself to say the actual thing that I mean. I've become really allergic to the righteous and rhetorical parading that I've seen in so much of this space as we attempt to learn how to undo and do and see into the future. And so when I speak about the assembly program, I'm going to try to be as specific as possible, to speak not of these larger terms that are equated with the criminal justice system, but instead to speak sincerely and honestly as an artist in the ways that I have grown into this work, and therefore how the work has called me into it. I'm going to share my screen. And hopefully you're seeing a window front space. I'm sure someone will let me know if it's not in front of you. But the assembly program, which again operates out of the arts-based nonprofit Recess, actually started out of the satellite space 5 years ago. A program in which I co-founded with our co-director, Allison Weisberg, which all came into fruition within the span of 2 months. Now, to quickly give you the nuts and bolts, because I want to get to the content of the practice and the philosophy and principles of the work, let me just quickly tell you that this work, which started 5 years ago, probably not accidentally following the election of Trump, where there was an opening in which an arts-based diversion program could all of a sudden enter and exhibit some possibility of engagement within a system that really in the past has had no time for the arts. And so we work and still do work. We worked and still do work in conjunction with our partners, Brooklyn Justice Initiatives, which are housed within the court system. Those partners at the time, 5 years ago, would assess nearly up to 160 misdemeanor cases per day. And because we are in New York and because of progressive legislation, specifically in Brooklyn, those misdemeanor charges almost uniformly qualify for what is entitled diversion, which for us entails young people joining us rather than having their case pursued in court. And after a 4-week cycle of workshops, which I will describe in a moment, their cases can be closed and their records sealed so that they avoid an adult record that might interrupt everything from housing to employment, to their education prospects. And because of our track record, a track record over the 5 years, not based on the metrics of the court, but which I will certainly speak to soon, but based on metrics that we determine in terms of possibility and quote unquote success, we've since also have emerged into felony charges in direct collaboration with the Kings County District Attorney's Office, the Brooklyn Downtown Criminal Court. Now, I mentioned that we measure our success differently from the court, because what you will hear statistically is that we have one of the lowest recidivism rates in the country, in the landscape of diversion. I could also boast that we have one of the highest retention rates across the nation, meaning once a young person starts our program, they decide to stay on with us. But whenever I have the opportunity to speak to a public regarding this type of programmatic possibility, this type of system intervention, it's important to me to say that those metrics don't mean a thing. Because I come into this work with full acknowledgement that our Black and brown human beings, our relationship with law enforcement, and our ongoing interaction with police certainly does not cease with one charge or case. And so instead, my investment in everyone that comes to the assembly program, our other practitioners, our staff, our artists, we're dedicated to a different kind of work. A work which is meant to restore the humanity of a young person that from an early age has been told that their lives are worthless. A young person who has been so ingrained with messaging that devalues how they see themselves, that prison just becomes a matter-of-fact situation, one in which they tell themselves that it's just a matter of time. So what continues to drive this work is the way in which a young person, when entering the assembly program, already starts to describe themselves within some preconceived notion of criminality, using language that would be otherwise imposed on their bodies and psyches by the criminal justice system and certainly by the media. And so we dedicate ourselves differently, utilizing a methodology that allows us to see how narratives, in this case of imprisonment and arrest, flow through the body and therefore are told through body language with a different kind of truth. And this work is organized around really two principles. One in which a young person, and I would say I would expand this to many different populations, but a young person is able to externalize a story, quite often that is clouded by emotion, by trauma, and see it played out in front of them through a different body, through a completely different set of eyes. And alongside that, it allows the group to collectively analyze all the forces outside of personal decision-making, environmental forces, institutional forces, instances, and circumstances that might have occurred in the school, in the streets, at home, well before any interaction with law enforcement, how those circumstances and forces may have led to that moment. And it's in that space, it's in allowing us to detect where a story is lodged in someone's body that we dial down to its most essential information, its emotive content. And it's in that space that we gather meaning around these stories so that a young person might be able to grapple with it differently. And more importantly, might be able to insert themselves in their own story so they understand it's a story of a human being and not a story of a criminal. And with that understanding, may move through the world knowing and feeling in their bodies that they are not defined by that experience. And so what you're seeing in front of you is not the program in action, because that is an undertaking that is completely anonymous. Instead, I'm going to show you a series of images that exemplify the program in efforts and opportunities in which we've expressed this methodology, but in public-facing work. Early on in our trajectory, a few of our young people decided to open up the space and welcome audiences into this process in which they would revisit the memory of a story. And rather than hold the responsibility of inhabiting that memory themselves, invited audience members to help them shape that memory, sculpting the scene, the tableau, so that there's a shared accountability and responsibility to how that young person remembers, but also that there's a shared responsibility to the ways in which we see and perceive that story. This young man telling of the first instance that they were pulled over by the cops, or this young man describing a moment in which just the presence of law enforcement forces everyone to run. Or this young man really clearly and eloquently sharing how his experience of criminalization did not start with the cops, but instead in school, with alienation that occurs with a dynamic with a teacher. And we've taken these other opportunities. Here you're seeing an image of a very similar exercise being conducted at the Whitney Museum. Again, where a young person invited audience members in, not sharing the specifics of the narrative, but instead collectively placing ourselves in so that one story actually becomes the story of many. You know, we organize ourselves not around the details of a single narrative, but instead around oftentimes a single word. Words like alienation or isolation or loneliness. And it's in that space that we start to understand that what is housed in our bodies in terms of fear is actually quite familiar across stories, across subjectivities. And so what would otherwise be described in quite dramatic fashion as a story of criminal, all of a sudden gets reshaped into something that we all start to peer into, that we all start to understand. Because the way one of our young people are abandoned or isolated or uncared for, at the core of that is an element which is relatable. And therefore it becomes our responsibility to share in that story, to share in the ways in which our young folks are criminalized. And I'll return to that later. As part of this work, it's incredibly important that our peer leaders, and by peer leaders, I mean young folks that have opted to stay along in a paid capacity. And quite often that takes the form of apprenticeship or mentorship work, where they are leading and facilitating workshops alongside me. And it's in that space that the organization, Recess, takes a much more radical stance in how they look at system intervention, allowing young folks to become part of a community that not only cares for them, but is accountable to them well after the closure of one case. Another opportunity in which we went to the Portland Museum of Art in Portland, Maine, in which in an entirely unscripted fashion, we saw young folks again pull people into the memory, not only of here of a single narrative, but many, many narratives in which at the end of this exercise, every single person, nearly 200 people, were posed in silent, frozen gesture in the carving out of a mutual scene. Here, another event at the Guggenheim Museum, again, in which we sculpt the scene of what becomes a shared narrative. And this points to my belief in what I would call physical embodiment. And the argument behind that is that there are certain narratives that can't possibly be articulated verbally, that we quite literally do not have the language to express those narratives accurately. And so instead, as I started, there is a way in which there's a different kind of truth conveyed, an honesty that is palpable and in many respects universal. And so by pulling individuals closer to these stories and sharing in them, inhabiting them mutually, where we understand that there is a space in between, this being another facilitated workshop at Tufts University just right before COVID shutdown. We also start to move closer to individuals that we would otherwise see as an other. Because again, the way that fear is expressed through the body, there's something that's familiar in that. And so all of a sudden, what would otherwise be some preconceived narrative of criminality, all of a sudden starts to look more familiar. Because listen, mass incarceration, all of these large terms that I might share with you to be an umbrella frame or a framework for this discussion, those systems, whether it's the court system, the prison system, police system, predicate themselves on their invisibility. And it's at invisibility that they function. It's that invisibility which allows us to sit back and believe that only bad people go away. And so if we want to transform systems, how is it that we all implicate ourselves in that belief? How is it that we all contribute to these narratives of criminal? How is it that we see and unsee people? That is part of the objective of this work. And to therefore welcome and continuously care for these individuals, these young people, by expanding our offerings. Here you're seeing a video project that continued well after the court mandate, or internships and job placements. This young lady becoming a tour guide for Kehinde Wiley's sculpture in Times Square, or opportunities in which the work that we conduct, the artwork that we conduct in our print shop facility and other aspects of our work take the form of exhibitions or participatory workshops. And I stay with this image because the work is not in the output, although that is the easiest thing to share. It's in the relationships. And so I want to show you, I want you to remember these young faces, these faces that have become my mentees, that have become the life force of the entire organization. And so when I talk about this work, I'm talking about it in ways in which I have, of course, a deep belief, a deep passion in its working processes, in this methodology, in the ways that I do believe it restores and inspires an individual, gives them a power to navigate their own lives with a little more choice. But that is only half of the work. The other half of the work is in owning up to the relationships, in owning up to showing up for these young people. And that is where the work takes place. And so I omit those 3 words from my presentation, not because I don't believe in leadership or community or social justice. I believe in all 3 of those things. But I believe in those things only in understanding that what enables my leadership, what enables me to show up in community, what enables me to move a social agenda forward is not what I can do by myself. It is by, as an artist, unveiling the truth, wisdom, and power in other individuals. It's in building relationships of care and accountability to work toward a mutual goal in building up each other's humanity. And that, I believe, is where the critical work happens. And it's a type of work that implicates all of us. The title of this lecture being Transforming Systems. And if I'm going to be completely honest with you, I don't know that that is possible. Because systems like the court system, like police systems, like law enforcement, have a way of continuously reshaping themselves around reform so that they may just continue to oppress, just in a slightly different manner. And so I struggle philosophically with my own practice, with any engagement in system intervention. But I also believe and fall back on what I can sense in the space with these young folks and the transformation that occurs in each of our bodies, in each of our psyches, in the way that we're able to stand up a little straighter, the ways in which we're able to look each other in the eye, in the ways in which all of a sudden we see that even in struggle, we can live a full life. And it's my belief that if we continue to invest there, that we also continue to take more and more power from systems that seek to control, contain, and remove us. Thank you.
Thank you, Shaun. That was amazing. I thought I was really intrigued by the idea that you started with about artists not being typically invited to conversations about leadership, because really, I mean, throughout our history, artists have played really important roles, and people in, not just your type of art, but in all sorts of creative mediums have played a really important role in driving change forward. And clearly you're doing that right now. So thank you so much for sharing a little bit about your work and about your leadership style and the attributes that you as an artist bring to this work. I'm going to turn to the Q&A. I see that we already have some questions, and please, audience, keep them coming. Our first question comes from Erin Perry. Erin says, I appreciate the nature and intention of your work. What measures do you take to ensure that the situation remains safe in these community sharing spaces, that no one is triggered into an emotional, psychological space that becomes unsafe?
Yeah, that is where a lot of our conscious effort goes. And I also want to make a mental note to return to this notion of leadership, Juliana, but I'll get to that secondly. and as a practice that engages in difficult stories as they are held within the body, it becomes part of our responsibility to also understand how it operates, touches upon something like cognitive therapy, behavioral sciences, de-escalation, conflict resolution, and yet still function purposefully and fully as an arts program. One way to answer that is by creating space for all the messiness and understanding that safety is also not in politeness, but instead in welcoming all of the baggage that we each individually bring to the table. Now, in terms of trauma, what is embedded in our practice what is embedded as part of our practice is a working method in which no single narrative is held in the center. And I sort of mentioned this in the presentation, which is actually much more important to us to decenter any particular narrative around arrest and incarceration. So our starting point instead, the ways in which we organize ourselves, is often a single word, and that captures an emotive space. Something like, it could be something like anxiety, but it could also be something that like joy, something that is forward casting. And it's in that when we start to create the scene with our bodies, that no single narrative is displayed. Instead, it becomes a collective narrative. And so with that, the intentionality becomes not in analyzing a traumatic event, but instead expressing the ways in which we all can see one another in that emotional space, acknowledge one another in that emotional space. So the objective in the performative workshops, or as I call them, visual storytelling, is not in the therapeutic process of unpacking an event, although there are therapeutic, I would say there are therapeutic aspects to the work. There's relief in the work. There are ways in which a person can breathe and show up differently. But the ultimate objective is in crafting the scene so we all understand how we are not alone in our stories. And in that, where there's a sense of belonging, in which a young person doesn't have to navigate their histories nor their instance or case alone, and that we are all there to hold each other up. So that was a long explanation of one aspect of the workshop process. But I will also say in our working relationships, what has become incredibly clear to us is the way in which this process creates an opening in individuals in which they are grappling with the dynamics and circumstances and relationships of their lives in a very different way, with a fuller view. And so with that, as of recently, we've actually partnered with a mental health organization to continue the work of that opening. And specifically for our peer leaders that stay in relationship with us for a year, 2 years, sometimes longer. And so that there's always this process in which it's not, there's always a process in which we're building each other up and able to navigate difficulty with one another and still be in relationship.
Thank you so much. I'm trying to go through all of these questions. There's so many good ones. We have a question we have maybe a couple questions that I'll combine into one about the impact of the pandemic. I mean, first, just generally how the pandemic is impacting your work. Clearly these videos show, or your pictures showed that this is a lot of close contact. The body is essential to your work. And then Caitlin, who works here in Gispio with me, also added to that it's no secret that the pandemic particularly is affecting communities of color. And so, how has that been affecting your work, and how have you adapted to new demands?
So, of course, I have to say, I think we all realize that it's an incredible struggle. And in terms of, as you said, Julia, really the principles and strength, the values of our practice really stem from being in close intimacy and proximity with one another. It is a bodily practice. And with that, also acknowledging as in the last question, that for our young people and the communities that they come from, that the pandemic has only increased their physical experiences of isolation and fear and anxiety. And so I'm not going to lie to you. That is an uphill battle, and one in which requires that we navigate and bring intentionality every week differently and continue to move and reshape the programming. While, and this is important for me to say, while also as human beings feeling depleted ourselves. So as practitioners, as staff members, not being in full capacity. And so to give you some practical ways in which we are navigating, yes, much of our programming, not only for peer leaders, but also the court mandated cycles, have been translated into a virtual space. And I have to say, in some really brilliant ways through our practitioners that really adhere to the principles of the work, but also as not an attempt to simply move the lesson plans or our program into a Zoom space, but really acknowledging and utilizing the flatness of the screen for what it might provide, for what it's worth. And I think there's been some real success there, certainly in retention, and in some strange ways, virtual engagement has allowed us to expand our reach and our retention because you don't have to report into physical space. And just to give you some perspective, the young folks that we work with in the felony space, specifically in the gun charges cohort, in direct cooperation with the district attorney's office, those are young folks that pre-pandemic were forced to report in to the district attorney's office 4 days a week, nearly all day, interrupting any possibility of trying to improve their lives through a job, through schooling, or maintain their relationships, take care of their family. And so in some strange ways, we're learning that the lower stakes actually allows a person to show up in some ways in better form because they're able to move through their lives a little more easily. However, let's be real, Zoom is what it is. And so you never quite know what version of a person you're going to get. And energetically, it's been very volatile because the circumstances and tragedies of their lives is very real and ongoing. And so it's my responsibility, and everyone else that really tries to hold the space, to just welcome all of it, all of the ugliness, and really just spend more time checking in. And that being as equally important as any of the work that we might conduct in this space. I personally have also been holding one-on-ones because we learned, with of course all safety protocol, because we've learned that even the slightest contact, in-person contact, can really change the way in which a young person shows up in the work, and really changes the trajectory of how they will maintain their relationship with us, even with everything going on. We've also learned that it's incredibly important for us to have something always that we're building up towards, and having projects on the horizon so that there's something we can focus our attention on. And I can go on and on and on, but it is in continuously maneuvering all of the pain and the sadness and the ways in which someone and by someone I mean staff and educators as well, can't entirely show up fully. And so it's that, echoing what I said earlier, that the relationship becomes more important than any other aspect of the work, because you have to complete one another. There's a way in which just showing up for one another and listening starts to fill one another's capacities, again, because you understand that you're not alone. But can we do it all? Absolutely not.
Yeah, that was a really, thorough answer. Thank you. It also, I love that you brought educators into this, because I think so many are struggling with that, feeling like you provide support for others that truly need it, and you just can't be there for them in the ways that they need it in this medium. We have a question from Nicole that also brings teachers and artists together, and she wants to know, how can leaders like teachers and artists begin to sow the seeds for community-based work like assembly in their own communities? She's asking specifically if you have advice on how we engage with authorities and policymakers and other community stakeholders to get these kinds of programs off the ground.
Okay, that's a really, really great question. And it's one that will have a very difficult answer to it. Assembly doesn't happen without some decision that is made in the legislative space. In other words, when we were conceiving of assembly, and I think I mentioned this earlier, from our first conversations, we actually opened up a space and welcomed our first cohort only 2 months later. Now, why? Because it was determined by the court system that possibility could happen. And so in many respects, we were in the right place at the right time. There was very little requirement for us to convince our partners in the court of our potential value. And I say this to you for you to understand that it becomes a responsibility of an artist like myself to be attuned to where we might insert ourselves and at what time. And to always, of course, hone in on the practice and know our work well, but also to survey and understand these systems incredibly well. And that is often the failure of so many practitioners. We look to push against these systems without knowing how they operate. And so it was because of the studying and the research that we could detect that space and aim to fill it. But that space is created because the powers that pull and push those levers have determined that it can be. Now, I'm proud to say that just in the last few weeks, I've received phone calls from Denver, Boston, in which there seems to now be across the country an appetite within the legal system for alternative. And we do function as an alternative sentencing, not as alternative to incarceration necessarily, but alternative sentencing. And so the landscape is shifting. However, there are still to this day very little investments in what art and artists can bring to these spaces. Why? Because there's still the notion that art is only reserved for either positive relief, or that is only reserved for the elite. And so there's a very little understanding in the ways that art can serve in the space of system intervention and provide a different angle, a different way of approaching oppression and having a role in the way that we dismantle systems. And it's that where I think art and artistry bring a unique power and perspective to the situation. because, and there's something that I did not mention earlier, I have since in the last few weeks become co-director of Recess, occupying a leadership role in name. And I show up as an artist in everything that we do, because as an artist, I know that it is my role not to conduct things business as usual, but instead to imagine possibilities and to ask the difficult questions that are not being asked. That is where an artist comes in, is to know the landscape, to know how things are playing out, and to find the gaps, to see what's missing, and to ask people the difficult questions of what they are not looking at, what they are not trying, and what is still a possibility. And so as artists, and this practice, I look at this practice in everything I do within the space of Recess through an abolitionist lens. And it's through this abolitionist philosophy and political strategy that we are not only imagining some, unforeseen future, just the opposite. We are visualizing all the steps necessary for a world that doesn't require these systems.
I'm getting overwhelmed by the amazing questions in the chat and your amazing answers. And I feel like I'm failing at tracking all of this, but I'm trying. So we have two somewhat related questions. The first is about the particular role that museums play in your work. What do they provide that other spaces may not in exhibiting these stories? And what can they do better to make space for these stories, opposing their exclusive past? And then a similar question from one of our students is, how do you expand to reach audiences that might not otherwise either be sympathetic to the cause or audience that might not be frequenting museums to see this work?
Yeah, interrelated questions and beautiful questions that I have to answer a few different ways. And let me try to work backwards. I think as educators and artists, there comes a moment in which there comes continuous moments, I should say, in which you have to understand where your efforts should be placed. Because there's only 24 hours in the day and you only have, as a human being, a certain amount of capacity. And so to do this kind of work, you also have to care for the self. And now, while I have taken quite a few opportunities to engage communities or those in seats of power that would not align themselves with my work, with my philosophy, I don't assume that all artists should do that. It takes a very particular type of skill and patience, and it's not necessarily where your efforts and energies should be placed. And I will also admit that there are certain publics, certain communities that are not worth my time because of a resistance in which I am not inviting in. I'm not invited in. I go to where I am invited in. And that is where at least there's a potential for the work to take hold. Now, with that being said, part of my mission, therefore, is to show up in these spaces. And quite often, as particularly when the work, at the outset of the work, I was the only artist in these spaces filled with legislators and lawyers and other legal advocates and administrators. And I realized the importance of my presence in some of these convenings and large conferences in which so much thinking and decision-making was being made without the presence and experience of those most impacted. And so as an artist, I could show up on behalf of other community members and ask those questions. What is it that you're missing? Who is it that is not being represented here? And doing so in a positive light and doing so in an imaginative space. How can we imagine a different process? And that is why I continue to show up in this work, because I see that the responsibility of that role. And now in terms of museums, and there are aspects of my larger practice that certainly stem from the same methodology, the same kind of principles that show up in those institutional spaces. And unfortunately, it becomes part of my role and my accountability to the work to pull out the ways that the museums can reshape itself around the practice so that they simply can't be a host to the work, but instead the individuals that make up the museums have to move closer to the work in the communities that my practice support. And that means that I'm engaging from everyone from development and marketing across to security and visitor services when an institution decides to hold my practice. Because it's important to me that the culture be implicated, the culture of that place be implicated. And that anyone that is coming to my work is coming to it and being held with respect and care that museums are not known for. Which goes to the other part of the answer, which is, I don't necessarily trust museums, nor should I have to, because I think we've been shown time and time again that there is an inherent contradiction embedded within these institutions in which they can purport to project and bestow democratic values of inclusion and care in the work that they exhibit, while at the same time not being as considerate for the publics that come in or don't come in, and the BIPOC staff members and educators that are quite often tasked with being the public face to the institution. And so until that is continuously critiqued, that contradiction, that hypocrisy, artists like myself should not be asked to trust museums.
I think something you mentioned earlier about self-care leads really nicely into another question we have from a participant that wants to hear more about what self-care looks like for you in relation to your creative process. And they note that all of this work just sounds exhausting. I'm sure it is exhausting for you. You mentioned that it can be exhausting for other artists. So how do you practice self-care?
Thank you for that. I won't lie to you, I fail at it all the time. And I think many of us do, and I assume many in the space are potentially educators or community practitioners. It's in the commitment that we fail because we give so much of ourselves. Now I'm going to contradict that answer in a moment and say that this last year has been one of the most tragic years of my life, personally. And yet you're asked to share in the trauma of the individuals you work with and the communities that you care about. And so the question is, how do you continue to show up without not only depleting yourself, but not addressing the things that you are going through? And so, yes, I mean, I will tell you that I take part in contemplative practices. I double down in meditation. I personally box, that is one of my outlets, and I do all of those things. I do these things because it is a space of repair. It is a space of internal quiet, but I won't lie to you and say that nourishes me entirely. What I have to rely on is in the engagement of the work, in sharing in the pain. There is still a way in which that exchange fills you because it is a give and take. And when you do your work well, then you realize that you are invigorated and empowered, not because of what you bring to the space, but equally because of what you get back. And so these young folks, while I commit and give and give and give, they also give me so much. And what they bring and what they say and how they are concerned for me. And I will also say very, you know, I have the advantage of coming home to a place of joy with my 4-year-old daughter, 13-year-old stepdaughter, with my wife, and knowing that I always have that. I always have that moment. And that is what I kind of depend on.
Thank you so much. I think it's a really challenging thing for leaders, right? To take care of yourself while you're trying to take care of others, organizations, people, and especially for leaders in roles like your own, where you're dealing with real humans with real problems. But it's also so critically important.
I think the thing I'm trying to say is if you really are committed to your work and the work of building up a human being and being in relationship with community, then there, as part of the process, you become more able to express your own vulnerability and allow other people to care for you. That it becomes integral to the practice. And so we have to continue to disrupt these notions of leadership as a hierarchical structure in which you're standing above or separate from others. Leadership comes, deep, true leadership comes in relationship with the communities that you care for, and that in return, energetically and otherwise, will continue to care for you. And that is where the work happens.
Shaun, I can't think of a better quote to end on, and we are at 2 p.m., but that was beautiful. Thank you so much for sharing. Audience, thank you for being active participants in this webinar. I'm sorry if we didn't get to your questions. I think there was a question that about whether a recording will be available, and the answer is yes. So we are recording this, and we will post the recording on our website. So please feel free to check that out, share it with your friends, and I hope you all have a wonderful weekend.
Thank you all so much. That was beautiful. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Shaun.